All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for another great collaboration with the Addison Gallery of American Art. My name is Nicole Kramer, and I am the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Memorial Hall Library in Andover. And I want to thank the Addison for fostering great connections and allowing us to share their exhibitions and artwork with the wider community. The Addison Gallery is located on the campus of Phillips Academy here in Andover. It is free and open to the public, and if you are close to Andover, I encourage you to visit the gallery to enjoy their regularly changing exhibitions in person, including the Tommy Kha exhibition that we will be learning more about today. Throughout today's program, please put any questions in the Q&A, and we will plan to address as many of them as we can at the end of the talk. We are recording today's program, and everyone who registered will receive a link to the recording by tomorrow afternoon. And today we are joined by Rachel Vogel, Assistant Curator at the Addison, for a discussion of work by Tommy Kha, the second recipient of the Addison's Bartlett H. Hayes Jr. Prize. He examines how we construct belonging and otherness through photography, inventing new models for self-portraiture with a critical eye toward the medium's long history of absences and erasure. Tommy Kha, Other Things Uttered, will be on display at the Addison through January 25th. So we hope that after today, you can join us in person at the Addison to see things there. Rachel, thank you so much for being here. I will now turn things over to you.
Thanks. Let me just share my screen. All right. Well, thank you all for being here. And thank you, Nicole, and Memorial Hall Library. We've been partnering with Memorial Hall Library for the past few years, and it's just such a wonderful partnership to be able to expand our reach and to reach all of you. I hope that many of you are local and can come see the exhibition in person, but I also know that there are some of you who are from locations further away. And so I'm thrilled to be able to present this exhibition virtually and give you a taste of what we have up at the Addison. So, as Nicole mentioned, I'll be talking about our Hayes Prize 2025 exhibition, Tommy Kha, Other Things Uttered. And so the Hayes Prize is an initiative that started in 2023 that really builds on the Addison's strong history of promoting firsts in American art. So we've provided some of the country's most notable artists with their first American museum exposure. And this includes being the first museum to give an exhibition to Josef Albers in 1934. We mounted the first retrospective of John Sloan's work in 1938. We presented the first full-scale museum retrospective of an abstract expressionist painter with the 1948 exhibition, Hans Hofmann, Painter and Teacher. And also that year, 1948, we were the first museum to exhibit works by Ruth Asawa, Kenneth Noland, and Andy Warhol, and subsequently were the first museum to acquire a work by Asawa. And these are just some of the significant firsts that the Addison is proud to have enabled. And so to continue in that tradition, biannually, the Hayes Prize provides a contemporary artist with their first solo museum exhibition, and that is accompanied by a exhibition publication. The artist is also invited to do an artist residency on campus, and we acquire one or more of their works for the museum's collection. And Tommy Kha is the second recipient of the Hayes Prize, following Reggie Burroughs Hodges in 2023. And I'll be obviously speaking a lot about Tommy's work over the next hour, but just as a brief bio for Tommy, he's a photographer who was born in Memphis, Tennessee, and currently lives in Brooklyn. He received his BFA in photography from Memphis College of Art and his MFA in photography from Yale University, where he currently teaches. And in addition to being a recipient of the Hayes Prize, he is a 2025 Guggenheim Fellow and the recipient of the 2023 Center for Photography at Woodstock's Vision Award, a 2022 NYFA Photography Fellowship, and 2021 Next Step Award. His first monograph, Half Full Quarter, was published by Aperture in 2023, and as I will discuss, his second publication in conjunction with this exhibition is forthcoming shortly. So, to now introduce the exhibition, um, I am showing the facade of the museum because the first works that visitors actually encounter for this exhibition are before they ever even step into the museum. And so behind these pillars are hidden in these sculpture niches two works that were commissioned for this exhibition. And they're sort of tucked into these normally empty sculptural niches on the Addison's facade. And I love that the exhibition starts with these works because they really encapsulate three sort of main ideas of the exhibition. So first is the fact that Tommy is really expanding ideas of self-portraiture. So these are photographs mounted to aluminum. And in the photographs, Tommy has attached a mask of his face onto these sort of classical sculptural busts. And this idea of the mask and the cutout, the photograph of the photograph, is a common motif in Tommy's work that I'll be discussing extensively. And in describing these works and his use of the mask or the cutout, Tommy's explained, I wanted to find a way of representing myself without literally photographing myself. So instead, I've been making photographs of my face and body as a way to control my representation. And so we see his exploration of new modes of self-portraiture. How can we make a self-portrait without taking a photograph of oneself, using a surrogate or a stand-in for your own representation? And as he describes in that quote, this is a tool or a means of controlling his representation. So we might think about the ways that we shape our identity, how we present ourselves, the masks we wear for others and for ourselves. So how do we craft a self-portrait that is grappling with these aspects of identity, with the idea that identity is maybe not as static or straightforward as merely taking a photograph of oneself might suggest. And so the second sort of main theme that I think these works speak to is expanding the idea of photography more broadly. And as you see, as we'll get further into this exhibition, Tommy's really also exploring what constitutes a photograph and all of the different forms that photography can take. So here we have photographs that are sort of masquerading as sculptures. When you turn to the side or you approach them from the side, you see that they are sort of barely three-dimensional. But when you're facing them straight on, as you see in these photographs, there's this sort of trompe l'oeil effect where they sort of appear as if they're, these traditional sculptures in the round. And I think this trompe l'oeil effect is also something that Tommy is really playing with in these works. It makes us think of photography as a tool of maybe deception or at least misdirection. How do we think about the truth value of a photograph? Does a photograph purport to tell a truth that, in fact, has been sort of constructed or manipulated? And we also think about photography as this act of cutting out. So here, to make these works, the sculptural busts are cut out from a sort of surrounding photograph. And this is also a motif that Tommy will play with, both in his use of masks and cutouts of himself, but also in other installations throughout the exhibition. And the third sort of theme that I think these works sort of present up front is this idea of challenging an art historical tradition. And so we have, these classical busts that really carry so much weight in the history of Western art. And he's literally pasting his own face onto these symbols of this art historical canon. And to quote Tommy again, he says, as a queer Asian American brought up in Memphis, I did not see myself represented in the media or the canon of Western art. I think literally inserting myself into representations is part of my way of trying to resolve that. And throughout this exhibition, there's so many ways that Tommy's work is not only challenging who is represented in the history of photography or in the history of art more broadly, but also the ways that museums or institutions present these histories. And so the last reason why I really appreciate that these are the first works that visitors encounter is the way that they play into this sort of subtle idea of institutional critique or rethinking the rules of exhibition and display and the role of museums in sort of constructing these histories. So now we've actually entered into the museum. This is the rotunda. And so the first work within the museum that we encounter is an installation titled The Chain Letter Project #2, A Collective Memory. And so you see that on the right panel there, and it extends to these other two panels once you're facing the door. And so these photographs, there's 800, 900 or so of them, are not actually taken by Tommy. These were photographs that were taken by students and faculty of four different schools. You see the faculty and the courses listed to the right. And so Tommy provided a series of prompts to these students and provided them with disposable cameras that each course sort of shared amongst itself. And in response to these prompts, they produced these photographs that are combined into this installation that Tommy describes as a collective memory. And so this is the second iteration of this project. It builds on a previous version of it that Tommy installed in 2023 at the Baxter Street project space. And this version of the project really started during COVID when people were isolated. There was a major uptick in anti-Asian hate crimes and violence. And Tommy began to think about photography as a means of forming community, as a means of sharing solidarity. And so he sent disposable cameras and a similar list of prompts to his friends in the Asian American community across the United States and asked them to photograph their daily lives, responding to these prompts. And the photographs that came back then tell the story, the sort of layered story of these lives that were, lived at this time largely in isolation, these kind of solitary existences that are being brought together to create the sense of community. And so for the second iteration at the Addison, again, Tommy sent out these prompts, but also included prompts that were written by participants in the initial iteration. So again, this sort of sense of this chain letter that, we're forging new chains that through this project are linking not only all of the participants of the first iteration and then all of the participants of the second iteration, but also joining them together. And this will continue. I know Tommy already has plans in the works for bringing this project to the West Coast and students there. So it continues, the chain continues. And so a lot of these prompts are based on this idea that photography is this sort of ubiquitous and accessible medium, and this becomes a sort of opportunity for students to sort of see themselves as photographers, to sort of understand the possibilities of photography. But what I also really love about these prompts is, reading these. How do you make a portrait of a person without photographing them? How do you make a non-portrait portrait? photograph your favorite door in your neighborhood, photograph graffiti or a mural. These are themes that emerge in Tommy's own work, and this almost becomes a kind of cheat sheet for understanding the themes that drive his own work. And it almost becomes a sort of scavenger hunt as you enter in the gallery, you pick up this list of prompts, and you can almost match them to Tommy's own work throughout the exhibition. And visitors are invited to take this list of prompts and using the QR code that you see at the top of this postcard, submit their own photographs. So, to continue to add to this sort of collective story, this collective memory. And as you see in these photographs, there's sort of space left in these front panels to allow for this installation to continue to grow and expand. And so as I mentioned, Tommy's thinking about photography as this point of accessibility, as this point of bringing together community. And a lot of that is grounded in this idea that photography is a language. And he's thinking about the importance of language, of translation and mistranslation, for his experience as the child of immigrants, and how photography might be a tool to sort of overcome the barriers of different language or different culture, different customs, different generations, how this might be a way to sort of form community. And so the exhibition's title comes from, or is sort of an homage to Teresa Hakuncha's 1978 performance, Other Things Seen and Other Things Heard. And Cha is a writer, a filmmaker, an artist, who's also thinking about these themes of translation and mistranslation and displacement, and the centrality of these to one's identity, and the identity specifically of an immigrant, or in Tommy's case, the child of immigrants. And so photography becomes then a sort of community. Another quote from Tommy, language is a communal activity, and communal activity is the reason we have slang, dialect, why we have accents. I'm making pictures so I can find other people that speak in the same way as me. So thinking about photography as a language helps make it more accessible, but also brings people together as something that, this is a shared language that we all, we live in a world of images, and this can become a sort of common point of communication. And here's some just details of the installation. All of these photographs sort of brought together. And it's fun to look at these installations and sort of try and guess what prompts individuals are responding to, but also just see the range of the approaches, the images themselves, how they're constructed, even the places where the photographic medium sort of fails. There's a great sort of section in the middle of these sort of blurred out or grayed out photographs, which instead of, discarding, Tommy includes as, this too is sort of the part of photography's language. And so as we go down the hallway, we're introduced to another body of work by Tommy called South Portraits. And so in this series, we're also thinking about, again, how do you make a portrait, a self-portrait that's not a self-portrait? So he's thinking about the role of place in shaping identity, how we are all formed by our surroundings, what imprint our hometown or our home country has on us and our experience, and how we fit or don't fit into these surroundings. And so he's especially interested in these kinds of examples of vernacular photography that he, is witnessing through his, journey through Memphis and other cities in the American South. And so on the left here, we see a photograph, again, photograph of photographs, where in the Shelby County General Store, we see all of these photographs of people celebrating, their game catches or, hunting, fishing, etc. And then on the right, we see this interior of a Chinese food restaurant in Memphis. And we see both the photograph of Jackie Chan, this photograph. This kind of tourist photograph light up box of China, and then even tucked into the corner of this frame are family travel photos. So these kinds of layering of experiences, of locations that are speaking to the role of photography in sort of understanding our everyday life, remembering and memorializing our experiences, and what role photography plays, very broadly. Um, and we also see, so then as we're moving down the hallway, we also see these photographs, these small unframed photographs that are lining the wall. In some places, as you see here, they're obscured. Um, and they wrap around the corner. And these are from Tommy's series, Signs or Signages That Sign What They Sign, Not What You Want Them to Sign. And so in this series, he's really capturing a sort of uh, landscape of the South through the sort of commercial signage that he encounters. And this series sort of initially started focusing on Asian-run businesses and thinking about how members of the Asian diaspora have imprinted themselves onto the Southern landscape. Even in places or moments where these communities have been hostile to them. But there's this sort of insistence on their presence that can be traced through this signage. And the series expanded to think about signage more generally, and as the title of the series suggests, thinking about the way that signage itself fosters community. Who are these signs speaking to? Who is their intended audience and who is not their intended audience? Using these kinds of ubiquitous, sort of understated aspects of the Southern landscape to really think about community and belonging, and what we can learn about a place through these sort of, often overlooked, examples of commercial architecture. And I told Tommy, as I was preparing for this exhibition and, spending a lot of time with these works, that it really changed the way that I, meandered through my neighborhood, taking a dog for a walk. I suddenly became so much more aware of the signs around me, what kinds of businesses made up the neighborhood, the sort of residue of closed businesses, this idea of the palimpsest of a landscape that's constantly reinventing itself is something that Tommy feels very strongly describes the South. And so I think, this kind of teaching of how to look in places that otherwise we wouldn't think to for these signs of community or these signs of belonging. And I think a very sort of apt comparison from this body of work is to another great Southern photographer, William Eggleston, also from Memphis, who's also, thinking about how to explore the South and the Southern experience through these kinds of understated moments. And so I think Tommy, through this series, is both sort of acknowledging and continuing, and also expanding on this project of representing the South. And I guess one last thing that I'll say about these series is that there is also this idea of photography as a tool of memorialization or of memory. Here on the left, We have this image of an altar. And this exhibition is dedicated to two loved ones that Tommy lost in the course of preparing for this exhibition. Um, and I think photography has this role in freezing time and preserving moments that makes it very close to this idea of memorialization. And this is a theme that we see thread throughout Tommy's work, whether it's this altar or the funeral car that we see on the other side of the hallway. Um, and this is just another, as we move into the main gallery, we'll see this as a kind of continued theme where there is both this layer of humor that I think runs throughout Tommy's work, as well as this undercurrent of loss and memory and memorialization, and thinking about photography's role in that. And to return one last time to this photograph, you'll notice that as these images from the sign series go against the wall, sometimes they're obscured. And so thinking this both goes back to the point I made at the beginning of how Tommy is sort of playing with these museological frameworks or the sort of rules for exhibitions. Typically, museums don't cover up photographs in installing works. Typically they don't have unframed photographs sort of lining the wall. But he's also playing with themes of visibility and invisibility, of obscurity, of obscuring, especially when thinking about what places are represented in these photographs, and how various communities have sort of imprinted themselves on the landscape, times in which that history is covered over. Tommy expressed that he had no idea of the rich history of Asian diaspora in the Mississippi Delta, that he didn't know that there was this sort of community of Asian culture so close to him growing up in the South, and that he was often meant to feel very alone in this community. And so thinking about what is made visible and what is covered over is sort of literalized through this exhibition device of hanging photographs on top of one another. And as you're sort of peeking into this kind of side hallway, there's a work that comes from a series that Tommy is creating from making puzzles of his photographs of himself, in this case, also of his mother, and sort of mixing these pieces together so we get this sort of blurred and fragmented photograph. And I think this also exemplifies many of these themes that Tommy is exploring, of the sort of fragmentation of identity, of the instability of identity, of the sort of fundamental unknowability of oneself, and how identity is really pieced together from all of these experiences, from place, from family, from community. And so identity really is this process of, piecing these different puzzle pieces together to form, in this case, a whole, but one that doesn't feel fully resolved, that we're still constantly in the process of becoming. And then at the end of the hallway, we enter into the main exhibition space. And all of the photographs in this gallery include this sort of major motif of Tommy's work of including a cutout of his face or his body somewhere within the frame, sometimes alone, as a stand-in for himself, sometimes in combination with his actual self. Um, and so this device really started as a practical one. He used this kind of cardboard cutout as a way of pulling focus. And so he would, when he is setting up his photographs, he would put the cardboard cutout there. And then he would, move back to set up the frame. And so this was a way of, constructing the photograph in camera. But as he sort of, maybe getting tired from running back and forth from cutout to camera, and maybe, realizing the conceptual power of this, realizes, what's wrong with the stand-in as the subject of the photograph itself. And so in this gallery, we see him exploring the possibilities and potential of this as a device. And so there are some examples where he actually prints, 3D prints these uncannily realistic models of his face. And so here we have on the left two of these masks tucked in, and then we see Tommy himself in the background. And we see the kind of constructedness of the photograph, right? He's holding the shutter release. There's this element of sort of peeking behind the curtain, of thinking about the constructedness of this photograph. And how that serves as a sort of metaphor for the constructedness of identity. And these here on the right, he made temporary tattoos of his facial features. And so we have this kind of doubling as he holds, a flashbulb in his mouth. There's this sort of uncanny, alien-like quality, the making strange of the sort of everyday experiences, the making strange of the self, to realize that, to define oneself is to sort of embark on this strange feeling of having to step outside of oneself to really think about who we are, that he encapsulates in these sort of, strange and uncanny images. And so here in we have a case that includes many of the cutout masks and 3D masks and temporary tattoos, a COVID mask of his face that's included in a photograph that I didn't include in this presentation. So these sort of, multiple facets of the self that also, even in the inclusion of these masks, is again this sort of peeling back, the kind of, showing of the guts of his photographic practice. And there is a sort of not only a strangeness, but sometimes a darkness to some of these images. With the image on the left, all of these cutouts of hands reaching out of the rocks at the Martha P. Johnson State Park in Brooklyn, could almost be something out of a horror film. We can imagine some sort of zombie apocalypse, the hands like shooting out from the ground. So there is a sense of, foreboding or anxiety that I think plays equally against the sense of sort of coy humor in his work. And I think that one way of thinking about this device of the cutout is also thinking literally about, belonging or not belonging in one's environment. The writer Hua Su, in speaking about Tommy's work, says they suggest an insolubility, the impossibility of assimilating, whether into a nation or into an everyday background. So there's this sense of, something being not right or not quite fitting that speaks to the sort of friction of, having multiple identities, being Asian American, being the son of immigrants, being queer in an environment where that doesn't feel like the norm. And I think we get a similar sense in the work on the right, where we have this headless cutout of Tommy flipped upside down. There is something, again, sort of ominous or foreboding as much as it is sort of playful and clever. And so here we see other examples of how he's using the cutout. But there's also, again, this sort of confusion between the sort of real flesh and blood Tommy and these representations. I love on the left where, we see Tommy's real self only in shadow. And so sort of thinking about, what's more real, what's more accurate, the sort of mask of his face or this sort of shadowy imprint that he leaves on the wall. And the work on the right is one of my favorites in the exhibition because it's only when you look very closely that you realize that this entire shape itself is a cutout. And you can only sort of see that because of this very thin strip on the arm that sort of gives away. You sort of see the corrugations of the cardboard cutout. And so you think that, like this, like so many of the other works in the show, that this is Tommy holding a representation before realizing that this is a cutout of Tommy holding a cutout of his mask and this sort of mise en abîme of representations of representations. The sense of getting lost in ourselves, of, having the pressure to present ourselves a certain way. I think, part of the idea of the sort of ubiquity and accessibility of photography is because we live in an image saturated world where we are expected to present, a certain version of ourselves on social media. And, the idea of finding that barrier between who we really are and the version that we present, I think is sort of playfully alluded to in these photographs where we have to work to figure out, where its seams are, where, what is real and sort of what is representation, and also remembering that the entire image itself is, of course, a photograph. So how do we sort of access the real, both in terms of the image that we're looking at, but also the real Tommy who is presenting himself to us in the form of these self-portraits. And so on the sidewall, we have a sort of selection of images that Tommy is making with his mother. And he says, I am a cutout of my mother. He sees almost this act of photography as, a way of exploring, his family history. And I love that, his sort of the deadpan look of his mother matches the sort of deadpan look that we have in these masks. The image on the left, we have both, this cutout of Tommy as well as, he himself hiding behind this dentist chair. And this dentist chair is Tommy's grandfather, his mother's father, who, after immigrating from Vietnam, set up a dental practice in their living room. And so we really have sort of three generations. If we think about this dentist chair also as a stand-in for his mother's father, this kind of family portrait of three generations in his family, and thinking about, what of him comes from his relatives, especially in a context where they didn't speak very much about their family's history of, his family immigrating first from China to Vietnam and then from Vietnam to Memphis, sort of in the context of the Vietnam War. And so having to almost discover which aspects of himself come from his family without having that firsthand access to hear, about his family's past, about his history. Um, and then the image of the right, again, this sort of kind of uncanniness, this making strange of the mother-son relationship. And in the process of making these photographs, these were a collaborative effort. And making these photographs both required, a different level of communication and understanding with his mother, as well as, her, willing participation. So going back to the idea of photography as this way of, forming a communal language, maybe photography and making these photographs with his mother became a way of communicating in moments where she was not willing to share verbally or in words. These photographs help communicate or convey or transmit something in a different form. And to continue on the ways that Tommy is sort of disrupting museum conventions, we are playing with scale, both the framed photographs and also these sort of large vinyl blow-ups that he is installing in a corner. So the photograph is folding around both sides of the wall and then hanging photographs on top of this other photograph. I love the way that this image, almost again to this recurring idea of kind of trompe l'oeil, that this photograph seems hung on the blackboard of the classroom in the background of this image. But also that there is, again, this sense of danger or loss or pain, both in, the image of his head. Do I have a close up? There we do. Of his a mask on this burner of the stove in this sort of dangerous, perilous space. Or the image on the right, where he had a very short window. He reached out to his network to find out if anyone had a funeral home that would be willing to use, that would be willing to let, sorry, that would be willing to let him use the showroom. And so we had like an hour and a half window. And so he, brought this cardboard cutout of himself and staged this photo shoot, in the sort of morning window before there was a wake in the afternoon. That I think this is the sort of most literal instantiation of what I was discussing before about these themes of sort of loss and photography's role in sort of in memory and sort of contending with loss. And I think that is the last slide that I have. And so we have about 15 minutes, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Definitely looking forward to seeing the show in person.
Actually, sorry, I just realized that was the
Oh,
last slide. I'm
oh,
so
go ahead.
sorry. I thought that there was more, but I think there, sorry, I have one last work and then I'd be happy to answer questions. I'm so sorry. Um, the last work is, and I'm would have been so remiss to have not mentioned this, is this installation that Tommy has been working on for over 5 years, called Flatlands. And so this is this sort of three-dimensional immersive collage, where he's taken photographs and he's cut out, repeating the sort of imagery of the mask cutout, along with these sort of domestic interiors that are printed on fleece to sort of create this sort of something that operates halfway between a kind of stage set or a family altar. And so here are some close-ups of, there's fruits and the Danish cookie tin that always seems to have sewing supplies and never cookies in it. There's images of dim sum. There's images of the sort of antique sculpture busts. There, are these sort of various references. And what I appreciate about this work is that there's so much to look at that every time I see this work, I latch onto something else. And there's such a powerful way to return to this idea of the sort of communal role of photography, that every single person, no matter their age, who encounters this work, latches onto something and can relate to something. And there's this such powerful evocation, the ability for this work to sort of make those memories come to the fore. And so it becomes this, much like the work in the Rotunda, this sort of collective memory, where he's also thinking about, again, the sort of domestic interior as the space of the original formation of identity, but also where we learn how to act out the person that we are. So this idea of this kind of stage set, or the fact that these are facsimiles of real things, this is where we figure out who we really are in the context of this sort of our domestic upbringing. And as I said, they've been working on this for 5 years, and it keeps growing and accumulating, and new objects sort of join this installation. And he sees this process of iterating and restaging this installation as a kind of form of cultivation. So it's sort of tending this garden of memories and family histories and customs. And we also see this sort of expansion of his photographic practice into three-dimensional space. So again, thinking about what are the different forms photography takes, and also literalizing that aspect of photography that is, cutting out an image from the world becomes this sort of 3D collage. And now that was my final slide. Sorry again for that confusion. And now I'm happy to answer any questions that people have.
Well, I am so glad that we got to see that last piece because I think that's one that you definitely want to spend a significant amount of time with in person when you visit the show. Um, Really fascinating. So thank you so much. We have a couple questions that have come in, but if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We did have a question about the first, they said the first two works that were shown, they were curious about the dimensions of them. I'm guessing they mean the ones that are hung outside of the building is
Yeah,
my
let
guess.
me,
But if I'm wrong on that, Carla, please type in and clarify.
yes, let me reshare my screen. And so these works are a little less than 4 feet high. And so I would say the one on the left is, sort of maybe a little larger than life size. The one on the right, which is hung higher, is sort of larger than life size, but from the scale that you're in, sort of, there's that kind of optical effect. So I do think that there is this sort of, the scale of being close to life size or a bit above life size sort of plays into um, the power of these images as and this idea of these cutouts as sort of surrogates of Tommy himself.
Thank you. So we have a question about with the way the show was hung, was Tommy really involved in like the installation of the show? It seemed like probably yes, based on some of the ways things were put together.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that I really appreciate about this exhibition is that, every aspect of it really is true to Tommy's voice. So, this project started about a year and a half ago with Tommy coming to campus and meeting faculty and discussing not only what works we would include in the exhibition, but also a big emphasis on what sort of programming and what sort of collaborations he would be able to do as a part of his residency on campus. And so he was here several times the last academic year, first meeting with classes, and then, and this was as he was sort of constructing the prototype to Flatlands in the artist studio that we have on campus. And so classes were coming in and seeing this as sort of it was, coming into into existence. And then he came again to speak with students about the Chain Letter Project and to introduce that project and sort of launch that project. And he'll also be coming back as an artist in residence in the fall to work with additional classes. So he's been very involved, not only in the exhibition, but in sort of wanting to become a part of the Addison and broader Andover sort of community and bringing that aspect of community into this exhibition. And then, yes, for the actual installation of the exhibition, he was here for a week, constructing, meticulously staging every piece in Flatlands. And yeah, it was very important that, he be able to express himself not only in the works, but how the exhibition was hung. And so, when we first did our mock-up to sort of see, okay, what's going to fit on the wall, and he's like, okay, yeah, this looks good, but like, I don't want any of them in a straight line. Like, that's not the look that we're going for here. And so it was extremely collaborative in making sure that the exhibition sort of reflected his vision and often that did sort of push, as I mentioned before, the kind of expectations of typical ways that museums hang. So, folding a work in half across a corner, or, concealing photographs underneath another frame. This was all part of Tommy's vision that, we're happy to facilitate, but ultimately, the installation as much as the works are Tommy's work.
That's one of the great things about your museum is that the way the exhibitions change so frequently, you can really take risks, try something new, see how it works. And that's one of the things I love about getting to visit and see something new every time. We've had a few people who were really inspired by the project with the prompts and the list of prompts, and we've had a few requests. Is that list available anywhere? Is it something that we could share?
Yes, it is. Because I'm sharing my screen. Hold on, let me stop sharing. I think I can find the link that, well, perhaps I shouldn't try and do this while I'm while we're being recorded. But yes, there is
Yeah,
a
so
link.
if you are able to share it with me afterwards, I can send it out in the follow-up email to everyone because I
Perfect.
think there were a lot of really fascinating ideas that I'm sure people would like to explore themselves maybe. But yeah, that's such an amazing project. I love the bringing of communities together. And now we just have appreciation and someone who reflects something that I'm sure a lot of people who have already seen this exhibition might feel. They said they saw it a few weeks ago, um, but they, now having learned so much more, would are planning to have to go back and view it again because I think there's so many that you want to explore and spend more time with after getting a little insight. So we appreciate you taking the time to share some of the background and stories that go along with the photographs. And we thank you so much. Again, the Addison is on the campus of Phillips Academy here in Andover, free, open to the public. This exhibition will be there through January or just about. So you've got some time. And we partner for other virtual talks as well as in-person tours. So, visit the Memorial Hall Library website or the Addison's website, and you can see about upcoming programs and events. Um, and again, I thank everyone who tuned in this afternoon. I will send out that follow-up email to you probably tomorrow. And Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks to all of you for being here, and I hope to see you all at the Addison.
Great, thank you.